I was standing in Sandra's living room holding printed emails between her and a private DNA lab, when she looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I was protecting my son. You were never good enough for him." No shame, no guilt. Just that cold, polished smile she wore to church every Sunday. That was the moment I realized this woman hadn't just tested my daughter's DNA. She had been trying to erase me from this family for 8 years. My name is Arya, and I want to tell you something that took me 8 years to fully understand. Some people don't hate you loudly. They hate you quietly, carefully, and with a smile so polished you start questioning your own instincts. That was Sandra, my mother-in-law, a woman who wore pearl earrings to church every Sunday and said "bless your heart" like it was a compliment. It wasn't. In New York, where I built my life, my marriage, my family, she was the one crack in the foundation I kept ignoring. And cracks, if you leave them long enough, bring the whole house down. I met Daniel 8 years ago at a rooftop gathering in Manhattan. He was warm, funny, the kind of man who remembers how you take your coffee without being asked. We fell in love fast and hard, the way you do when you're young and you believe love is enough to protect you from everything. We got married 2 years later. Small ceremony, just close family. I remember standing at the altar thinking I was the luckiest woman in that room. I didn't notice Sandra sitting in the front row, watching me walk toward her son with eyes that weren't celebrating. They were calculating. The first sign came 3 weeks after the wedding. Sandra called Daniel to ask why I hadn't sent handwritten thank you notes to every guest. Not typed. Handwritten. Daniel laughed it off. That's just mom. She's old-fashioned. But it wasn't about thank you notes. It was about establishing something early, that I would never quite measure up, that no matter what I did, Sandra would find the one thing I hadn't done perfectly, and she would make sure Daniel knew about it. Quietly, consistently, like water wearing down stone. She never screamed at me, never called me names to my face. Sandra was far too smart for that. Instead, she operated in whispers and suggestions. A comment about how Daniel looked tired. "Are you sleeping okay, sweetheart? Is everything all right at home?" A question about our finances disguised as concern. "I just worry about you too. Manhattan is so expensive. I hope Arya is being careful." Little needles, slipped in so smoothly that by the time the sting reached you, she was already smiling about something else. And Daniel, who had grown up breathing her air, couldn't smell the poison in it. Then Lily was born, my daughter. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, the most perfect thing I had ever seen in my life. I genuinely believed a baby would soften Sandra. I was so foolish. She held Lily exactly once in the hospital, stiffly, briefly, like she was holding something that didn't quite belong to her. She handed her back to me without a word and walked to the window. Daniel said she was just overwhelmed with emotion, but I watched Sandra's face in that reflection, and what I saw wasn't overwhelmed love. It was something colder, something I didn't have a name for yet. As Lily grew, Sandra's distance from her became impossible to ignore. She remembered Daniel's childhood stories with stunning detail, could tell you what he ate for breakfast before his third-grade spelling bee, kept photo albums dedicated entirely to him. But with Lily, she'd forget her birthday by a day, mispronounce her name sometimes, Lily instead of Lily. Small things, maybe, but they added up. Every holiday, every family dinner, Sandra would pull Daniel aside for long private conversations while Lily sat next to me, eating quietly, occasionally glancing at her grandmother the way children do when they're waiting for warmth that never comes. I used to squeeze Lily's little hand under the table and tell myself it was fine. I told myself that lie for 6 years. It was a regular Saturday morning when everything started unraveling. I had a double shift at the hospital. I'm a registered nurse, and weekend shifts are brutal but necessary. Daniel had a work commitment he couldn't move. Sandra volunteered to watch Lily, and against every quiet instinct I had, I said yes. She had never done anything I could point to directly. Nothing provable. Nothing I could hand Daniel and say, "See? See what she is?" So I kissed Lily goodbye, told her I'd be home by 7, and walked out the door carrying a feeling I couldn't name. That feeling had a name. I just wasn't ready to hear it yet. When I came home that evening, Lily was sitting at the kitchen table coloring. She seemed fine on the surface, but she was too quiet. Lily is never too quiet. She's the kind of child who narrates everything she does, talks to her crayons, makes up songs about her dinner. That night, she was just sitting there, coloring inside the lines, very carefully, very deliberately. I sat down next to her, brushed her hair back, asked how her day was. She said it was fine, Then, after a long pause, without looking up from her drawing, she said, "Mommy, Grandma Sandra took some hair from my brush. She said it was for a project." My hand stopped moving. My whole body went still. I kept my voice calm. I asked Lily what kind of project. She shrugged the way 7-year-olds do. She didn't say. She just took the brush from the bathroom and pulled some hairs out and put them in a little plastic bag. A little plastic bag. I excused myself, walked to the bathroom, checked Lily's hairbrush. Several strands were missing. Not fallen out, pulled, deliberately collected. I stood there gripping the bathroom counter, staring at my own reflection, and something cold moved through my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. I had no proof yet, but my body already knew. I waited until Lily was asleep before I searched her room. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. I just knew something was wrong, and I needed to find it before I could convince myself I was overreacting again. That's what years of being gaslit does to you. It makes you distrust your sharpest instincts. I checked under the bed, inside the bookshelf, behind the little art supply box on her desk, and then inside the bottom drawer, tucked under a stack of coloring books. I found a crumpled receipt. A receipt from a private DNA testing company based in New Jersey, paid in full. Submitted 3 days ago. The name on the receipt was Sandra's. The sample collection date was today. I sat on Lily's bedroom floor for a long time, not crying, not screaming, just sitting there with that receipt in my hands, reading it over and over, trying to find a different explanation. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe there was something I was missing. But there are moments in life when your brain tries to protect you from the truth your gut already swallowed. And that was one of those moments. I folded the receipt, put it in my pocket, walked to our bedroom, and told Daniel what I had found. I watched his face, and what I saw there broke something in me that took a long time to repair. He didn't get angry. That was the thing that hurt most. He went quiet, looked down at his hands, and then said, "Arya, I'm sure she had a reason. You know how Mom is. She just gets in her head sometimes." She gets in her head. His mother had collected our 7-year-old daughter's DNA without my knowledge or consent, and his first instinct was to explain it away. I looked at my husband, this man I had built my life with, and I realized something devastating. Sandra hadn't just spent 8 years working on me. She had spent 35 years working on him, and her investment had compounded. I couldn't sleep that night. While Daniel lay beside me, I was on my phone searching DNA testing laws, parental consent, New York family privacy statutes. What I found made my stomach turn. In New York, collecting a minor's DNA without parental consent is not just morally wrong. Depending on intent and use, it can carry serious legal consequences. But more than the legal angle, something else was pulling at me. Why? Why would Sandra do this? What was she looking for? A grandmother who simply adored her grandchild doesn't secretly collect that child's hair. She wanted to know something specific, and the fact that she went to this length to find it, secretly, carefully, while I was at work, meant she had been carrying this question for a long, long time. I needed to know what that question was, so I started digging. And what I found made that DNA receipt look like the smallest piece of a much larger, much darker picture. Daniel had shared a family email account with Sandra 2 years ago, something they used for holiday planning, shared bills when we visited, boring logistical things. He'd given me the password once when I needed to forward a reservation confirmation. I don't think either of them remembered that. I opened that account at 2 in the morning, sitting at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and shaking hands, telling myself I was probably going to find nothing, that I was going to feel foolish and paranoid, and I would close the laptop and go to bed. I didn't find nothing. I found everything. The email chain was between Sandra and a private genetics lab in New Jersey, 14 emails going back nearly 4 months. 4 months. She hadn't done this on impulse. She hadn't woken up one Saturday and made a reckless decision. Sandra had researched labs, compared pricing, asked detailed questions about sample collection from minors, specifically asked whether a hair sample collected without the child's full understanding would still be valid for testing. She had planned this the way you plan something you know is wrong, carefully, quietly, making sure no one would see. I read every single email twice, and then I got to the one that made my blood run completely cold. In the third email, Sandra had attached a document, a breakdown of what she was requesting from the lab. She wasn't just testing whether Daniel was Lily's biological father. That would have been devastating enough. But that wasn't the full picture. She had requested a three-way comparison. Daniel's DNA, which she had submitted from a cheek swab she had apparently collected from his old childhood medical file she kept at her house. Lily's DNA, stolen from my daughter's hairbrush while I was at work. And a third sample, a female sample. One she had labeled in the document simply as R. I stared at that letter for so long it stopped looking like a letter. R. I went back through the emails searching for a full name, a context, anything. And then in the seventh email, Sandra had written a line that cracked the entire story open. She wrote, "I need to know if the child carries any biological connection to R before I make my decision about the estate." The estate. I sat back in my chair and pressed my hands flat against the table to stop them from shaking. Sandra's husband, Daniel's father, had passed away 4 years ago and left behind a significant real estate portfolio in upstate New York. Sandra controlled it. And apparently whatever she had planned for that inheritance depended on what this DNA test told her about my daughter. I dug deeper. I went back further in the email account and found an older thread, one between Sandra and Daniel's college ex-girlfriend. Her name was Rachel. They had dated for 3 years before Daniel met me, and from what Daniel had told me, the breakup had been mutual, clean, no drama. What I found in those emails told a completely different story. Sandra and Rachel had stayed in contact for years, not casually, not occasionally, but consistently. Birthday messages, lunch plans, phone call check-ins. Sandra had been quietly maintaining a relationship with her son's ex-girlfriend all through our entire marriage. While calling me family, while sitting at my dinner table, while holding my daughter stiffly in a hospital room and handing her back like she didn't belong. But it was one specific email from 18 months ago that stopped my heart completely. Sandra had written to Rachel, "I still have the sample from your medical visit. I kept it all these years because I always believed things would work out differently. I need you to trust me one more time." A sample from Rachel's medical visit. Sandra had access to Rachel's biological sample, something she had apparently held onto for years, waiting. Waiting for what? For her plan to finally find the evidence she needed to blow my marriage apart. She had constructed an entire fantasy that somehow, some way, Daniel and Rachel had conceived a child, that Lily wasn't mine, that she could prove it and use it to push me out and pull Rachel back in. It was delusional, it was obsessive, and it had been running quietly underneath my life like a hidden current for 8 years. I pressed my fingers against my eyes until I saw spots. Because the cruelest part wasn't even the conspiracy. The cruelest part was something else I found. A series of text screenshots Sandra had forwarded to herself from her phone to that email account. Texts she had sent to Daniel over the years. Carefully worded, perfectly timed texts. After our worst arguments, texts saying, "Daniel, I'm worried about her stability. I just want you to be careful." After Lily was born, "You deserve a complete family, sweetheart. I just hope you have that." After a miscarriage I had suffered in year 3 of our marriage, that I had told almost no one about, Sandra had texted Daniel, "Sometimes these things happen for a reason. God has a plan." She had taken every vulnerable moment in my marriage and quietly, methodically used it to plant doubt in her son's mind. Not with screaming, not with accusations, with suggestions, with timing, with the precision of someone who had been doing this for decades and never once got caught. I closed the laptop. I sat in my dark kitchen in New York at 3 in the morning, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to cry about this tonight. I wasn't going to wake Daniel up and hand him a version of the truth he could still find a way to reframe for his mother. I was going to walk into Sandra's house with printed evidence in my hands, and I was going to make her say out loud, in front of her son, exactly what she had done. No more whispers, no more careful smiles. She was going to have to look at me directly, for the first time in 8 years, and tell me the truth. I didn't sleep that night, not a single hour. I lay next to Daniel in the dark, listening to him breathe, thinking about how many nights I had lain in this exact position, wondering why I always felt slightly wrong in my own marriage. Like a painting hung 1 inch off center. Everything looks almost right until you really look, and then you can't unsee it. By 5 in the morning, I had printed every email, every screenshot, every lab document, 17 pages. I stacked them neatly, put them in a manila folder, and placed the folder on the kitchen counter. Then I made coffee, sat down, and waited for my husband to wake up. When Daniel came downstairs and saw my face, he knew immediately something was different. Not an argument different. Not a bad day different. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his t-shirt and looked at me the way you look at someone when you sense that whatever they're about to say is going to change something permanently. I slid the folder across the counter toward him without a word. I watched him open it. I watched him read, and I watched the color leave his face page by page, slowly at first, then all at once, the way light disappears right before a storm. He got to the email about Rachel's sample. He stopped. He read it again. He set the pages down and pressed both hands flat on the counter and just stood there, breathing. He said, "Aria, I didn't know." And I believed him. That was the complicated, painful truth of it. Daniel wasn't a villain in this story. He was a man who had been so carefully shaped by his mother's hands that he couldn't feel the fingerprints anymore. But belief isn't the same as absolution. I looked at him and said, "I know you didn't know, but I need you to hear what I'm about to do, and I need you to decide right now whether you're standing next to me or not." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, and we drove to Sandra's house together. Sandra lived 40 minutes north of us in a beautiful brownstone in Westchester that she kept immaculate, fresh flowers on the porch, white curtains, a welcome mat that said home is where the heart is. I had always found that mat quietly ironic. We rang the doorbell at 9 in the morning, and she answered in her robe, reading glasses on, a cup of tea in her hand. She saw Daniel first and smiled. Then she saw me, and something shifted in her eyes. Just slightly, just enough. She knew. Not everything, maybe. But she knew this wasn't a casual visit. She stepped back and let us in, and I walked into her living room, and I set that manila folder on her coffee table, and I sat down across from her and I said, "I need you to tell me who R is." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Sandra set her teacup down very carefully, very deliberately, on the coaster. She straightened her robe. She looked at the folder but didn't touch it. And then she looked up at me with those polished, practiced eyes and said, "I don't know what you think you've found, Aria, but I want you to be very careful about the accusations you make in my home." Still performing, still controlled, even now, caught, documented, exposed. She was still trying to manage the room. I had spent 8 years shrinking in front of that performance. Not today. I opened the folder myself. I placed the lab email directly in front of her, the one where she asked about collecting a sample from a minor without full understanding. Then the email about Rachel's sample. Then the screenshots of the text she had sent Daniel after my miscarriage. I laid them out one by one on her coffee table like cards in a hand she never expected anyone to hold. My hands weren't shaking anymore. That surprised me. I had expected to fall apart in this room. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in 8 years, completely, terrifyingly calm. I said, "I'm not accusing you of anything, Sandra. I'm showing you what you did. In your own words." That was when she broke. Not with tears. Sandra wasn't a woman who cried easily, and even her breaking had a kind of cold dignity to it. She sat up straighter, lifted her chin, and said, "I was protecting my son. Everything I did for Daniel. You were never the right woman for him. I knew it the first time I saw you. And I needed to know the truth about that child before I made decisions about this family's future. That child." She called Lily that child. Something detonated in my chest, not rage exactly, but something older and fiercer than rage. I stood up. My voice came out quiet and completely steady, and I said, "Her name is Lily. She is 7 years old. And you collected her DNA like she was a piece of evidence in a case you invented. She is not evidence. She is my daughter. And you will never be alone with her again." The room went completely still, and then, from behind me, I heard Daniel's voice, low, controlled, the voice of a man choosing his words the way you choose footing on unstable ground, carefully, permanently. He said, "Mom, I need you to look at me." Sandra turned to her son with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something almost frightened, like a woman who had just realized the architecture of her control was collapsing in real time. Daniel said, "Did you send those texts after Aria's miscarriage?" Sandra opened her mouth, closed it. He said, "Just answer me." The silence lasted 5 seconds. Then she said, "I was trying to help you see clearly." Daniel nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not agreeing but finally, fully understanding. He picked up the folder from the coffee table. He said, "We're done here, Mom." And he walked to the door and held it open for me. And I walked out of Sandra's house into the cold New York morning, and I breathed, deeply, completely, for what felt like the first time in 8 years. The drive home was quiet. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet that used to sit between Daniel and me after arguments. That heavy, loaded silence full of things unsaid. This was different. This was the quiet of two people who had just walked through something real together and were still processing the weight of it. Daniel drove with both hands on the wheel, jaw tight, eyes forward. Somewhere around the halfway point, he reached across the console and took my hand. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. But I felt something shift between us in that car. Something that had been slightly, chronically misaligned for years quietly. Finally, clicking into place. It wasn't fixed, but it was honest. And honest was somewhere to start. The first thing I did when we got home was call a family attorney. A woman named Patricia, who a colleague at the hospital had recommended. Sharp, experienced, exactly the kind of person you want in your corner when you're dealing with something that lives in the gray space between family dysfunction and legal violation. I laid out everything. The DNA kit, the receipt, the emails, Sandra's collection of Rachel's biological sample, the texts. Patricia listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "In New York, collecting a minor's DNA without parental consent is a serious violation of parental rights. Depending on intent and use, this can have significant legal consequences. You have a very strong case for a cease and desist, and potentially more." I exhaled so slowly I felt it in my spine. Patricia drafted a formal legal cease and desist letter within 48 hours. It was thorough, precise, and completely unambiguous. Sandra was formally prohibited from any unsupervised contact with Lily, prohibited from collecting or attempting to collect any biological material from my daughter, and warned explicitly that any further violations would result in immediate legal action. Daniel read the letter before it was sent. He didn't ask me to soften it. He didn't call his mother to warn her it was coming. He simply said, "Send it." 2 words. But after 8 years of watching him find careful, gentle ways to protect Sandra from consequences, those 2 words meant everything to me. I told Patricia to send it that afternoon. Sandra received the letter on a Thursday. I know because Daniel's aunt, his mother's younger sister Carol, who had quietly disapproved of Sandra's behavior for years, called Daniel that evening and said Sandra had spent the afternoon crying at her kitchen table. I want to be honest with you. I didn't feel guilty. I had spent years feeling guilty for things that were never my fault, absorbing blame that belonged to someone else entirely. What I felt when Carol called was something simpler and cleaner than guilt. I felt the specific, quiet relief of a boundary that finally had teeth. Sandra could cry. She had earned those tears herself, one calculated whisper at a time. But the piece of this story I didn't expect, the piece that still catches me off guard when I think about it, was Rachel. 2 weeks after the cease and desist was sent, I received a message through a mutual contact. Rachel had heard through Sandra's family that something serious had happened, had started asking questions, and had eventually been told about the DNA testing. About Sandra keeping her biological sample for years without her knowledge. About being used as an unwitting weapon in a plan she never agreed to and never knew existed. Rachel reached out to me directly. Her message was 3 sentences long. She said, "I had no idea. I am so sorry this was done to both of us. I think we were both being used by the same person for a very long time." I sat with that message for a long time before I replied. Because she was right, Sandra had spent years positioning Rachel and me as opponents in a competition neither of us had agreed to enter. Rachel wasn't my enemy. She was another woman Sandra had tried to reduce to a tool, a piece of evidence, a biological sample in a plastic bag, a symbol of the life Sandra had wanted for her son instead of the one he had actually chosen. Rachel and I spoke on the phone once, briefly, carefully. It wasn't a friendship. We were strangers connected by someone else's obsession. But there was something healing in that conversation that I hadn't anticipated. 2 women, looking at the same architecture of manipulation from different angles, finally able to name what they were looking at. The inheritance piece resolved itself in a way Sandra had not planned for. When Daniel's extended family learned what Sandra had done, the DNA testing, the legal letter, the years of calculated texts, the atmosphere around her changed permanently. Daniel's uncle, who co-managed the estate with Sandra, requested a formal review of how decisions had been made regarding the property. It turned out Sandra had been quietly maneuvering to exclude Lily from any future inheritance consideration, had even consulted a separate attorney about whether a grandchild's eligibility could be contested on certain grounds. That door was now firmly, legally, permanently closed. Lily's rights were protected. Sandra's maneuvering was documented. and every carefully laid brick of the empire Sandra had spent decades building her control inside. Her son's loyalty, her grandchild's future, her family's respect, had come apart in the span of 3 weeks. She didn't reach out to Daniel for 6 weeks after the cease and desist. When she finally did, she sent a letter, handwritten, which felt very Sandra. She didn't apologize, not really. She wrote that she had acted out of love, and that she hoped one day Daniel would understand her motivations. Daniel read the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. He didn't respond. I didn't ask him to. What Sandra had never understood, what controlling people rarely understand until it is far too late, is that love doesn't collect evidence. Love doesn't run DNA tests on children in secret. Love doesn't plant doubt in a man's mind about his wife after a miscarriage. What Sandra had called love for 35 years was something else entirely. It was ownership, and Daniel had finally, quietly, permanently, handed back the deed. It has been 7 months since I walked out of Sandra's house into that cold New York morning. 7 months since Daniel held the door open for me and chose, clearly, finally, without negotiation, to walk out with me. I won't tell you that everything healed quickly or cleanly, because that would be the kind of ending that sounds beautiful but doesn't actually help anyone. Real healing doesn't work like a light switch. It works more like a window you've kept painted shut for years. You have to work at it, edge by edge, until one day it opens and you feel air you forgot existed. The first thing I had to heal was something I hadn't expected, my relationship with my own instincts. Because the truth is, I knew. Not everything. Not the emails or Rachel's sample or the inheritance maneuvering. But I knew something was wrong from the very beginning. I felt it in that hospital room when Sandra handed Lily back without a word. I felt it at every family dinner when Lily reached for warmth that never came. I felt it in my stomach every time I dismissed a quiet, clear signal as paranoia or oversensitivity. Years of being subtly gaslit had taught me to treat my sharpest instincts as my least reliable ones. Rebuilding trust with yourself after that kind of conditioning, learning to believe what you feel before you have 17 pages of printed proof, that is its own quiet, necessary work. And it takes time. Give yourself that time without guilt. The second thing I want to say, and I want to say this carefully because I know some of you are living inside versions of this story right now, is that the most dangerous kind of toxic person is not the one who screams. It is the one who smiles. The one who brings casseroles to your house when you're sick and whispers poison into your husband's ear on the drive home. The one who has never said a single thing you could point to directly but has methodically, patiently dismantled your sense of safety from the inside. These people are harder to expose because they leave no obvious marks. They operate in suggestions and timing and carefully chosen silences. If someone in your life makes you feel consistently smaller, consistently wrong, consistently like a guest in your own family, that feeling is not paranoia. That feeling is information. Treat it like information. Daniel and I are in couples therapy now. That was his suggestion, not mine, which mattered to me more than I can fully explain. Because the work between us isn't just about what Sandra did. It's about what Daniel allowed, even without knowing he was allowing it. It's about the years he explained away the comments, smoothed over the moments, chose comfort over clarity. He is doing that work honestly and with real humility, and I respect him for it. Our marriage is not the same as it was before that Saturday morning, but I think it might be becoming something more honest than it ever was. And honest, I have learned, is worth more than comfortable. Lily is doing beautifully. She doesn't know the full details of what happened. She is 7, and 7-year-olds deserve to be 7. What she knows is that our home feels lighter now. Children feel things in their bodies before they understand them in their minds, and Lily has been singing while she colors lately, which she hadn't done for a while. She asked me once, a few weeks ago, why Grandma Sandra doesn't visit anymore. I told her that sometimes grown-ups need space from each other, and that she is deeply loved. Both of those things are completely true. She accepted that the way children accept things when they feel fundamentally secure, quickly, and then she moved on to asking if we could have pancakes. We had pancakes. If you are watching this and you recognize Sandra in someone in your own life, a mother-in-law, a mother, a sister, anyone who has spent years making you feel like you are too much or not enough or simply wrong for the life you have built, I want to say something directly to you. You are not imagining it. The subtlety of it does not make it less real. The smile does not make it less harmful. And you do not need 17 printed pages of evidence to trust what your body has been trying to tell you. Your instincts were built to protect you. They have been working this whole time. The question is whether you are finally ready to listen to them. Not tomorrow, not when you have more proof, not when it becomes undeniable. Now, today. Because the longer you wait for the obvious moment to defend yourself, the more of yourself you quietly hand over in the meantime. And you, your peace, your children, your marriage, your sense of safety in your own home, you are worth defending right now, exactly as things stand. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you. Not just for watching, but for staying. Because the women who stay through a story like this aren't just looking for entertainment. They're looking for something to hold on to. A reflection of something they've felt, but couldn't quite name. A reminder that what happened to them was real. That they weren't too sensitive. That they weren't imagining it. And if that's you, if some part of Arya's story felt uncomfortably familiar, I want you to know that you found the right place tonight. This community exists for exactly that. For the women who have sat at family dinner tables, feeling like beautiful, careful strangers. For the women who have dismissed their own instincts one too many times because someone they loved needed them to. For the women who have never had anyone look them in the eye and say, what was done to you was wrong, it had a name, and you deserved better than that. You deserved better than that. I want that to land. Not as a passing phrase at the end of a video, but as something you carry with you when you close this app tonight. If this story moved something in you, if it cracked something open, or gave language to something you have been carrying quietly, leave a comment below. You don't have to share everything. Even just the word same is enough. Because sometimes the most healing thing in the world is discovering that you are not alone in a room you thought only you were locked inside. And every comment you leave helps this story find another woman who needs to hear it tonight. Another Arya, sitting somewhere in the dark, holding a receipt she just found, wondering if she's overreacting. She's not, and neither were you. If you're new here, welcome. Subscribe and stay close, because every single week we sit together in this space and we tell the truth about family, about betrayal, about the quiet strength it takes to choose yourself when everything around you was designed to make you forget you had that option. These stories are for you. This channel is for you. And I am so glad you're here.